Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and a psychiatrist, and I work in private practice in Harley Street in London, in the United Kingdom. I want to explore today the famous interview Harry has just given to the BBC. Some people might describe it as an infamous and notorious interview now. And I want to talk a little bit about a psychological analysis of what's really going on in this interview. Although the media have gone big on the interview and it's been covered widely in the national press and broadcasters and on the internet around the world, I believe that reading between the lines in the way that I would argue only a psychologist or a psychiatrist can, there's more going on in this interview than people realize. I also want to discuss the fact that it could be the case that Harry is sending a signal to the royal family. What is that signal? What is that attempt at communication? And I also want to talk a little bit about the psychology of coping with loss. I think there's several things that happen in this interview which suggest that Harry is struggling to cope with the various losses he's experienced in recent years. This is an important subject. I want to use the interview to talk about this subject, coping with loss. But basically, all of psychiatric disorder, all emotional dysfunction, all stress we have in our life could be said to be due to trying to deal with loss. It could be the loss of not passing an exam, therefore the loss of the idea that you had passed the exam, the loss of a partner, maybe a boyfriend or girlfriend has dumped you, the loss of a job, the loss of the capacity to function if you've been in a car crash and lost through serious injury some function in your body. So basically, stress and difficulty in life and coping badly with stress in life usually comes down to coping poorly with loss. And I want to divulge a secret, which is that all successful coping with any kind of loss requires you to do 4 tasks. And these tasks are psychological and they have to be done in a certain order. I'm going to use these 4 tasks to pose the question, has Harry done any of these tasks? Or has he done some of them or some of them not so well? And might this explain why it would appear from the interview he's struggling when it comes to coping with loss? Okay, so let's go back to the interview itself and let's just give a global assessment of it, which I think will be fairly uncontroversial. But I want to say some much more controversial things later on, which is that, to be fair to Harry, although he's given the interview very shortly after the court announces its verdict, so it's clear that he's reeling still from the shock of it, he is fairly articulate in this interview. He speaks pretty clearly and in a very articulate and measured manner. So big tick there. The interviewer, unfortunately, in my opinion, as a journalist, did not do a very good job. And in particular, misses to ask a very important question, the kind of key question that is the elephant in the room. And this is one of the reasons why the public have become so cynical about legacy or mainstream journalism, which is why on earth did this journalist not ask the most obvious question? And is there some kind of collusion going on behind the scenes between various establishment institutions like the BBC and Harry? Because the BBC may want access to Harry in the future, they kowtow and don't ask the tough, important question. Harry is basically saying in this interview that he needs the state to provide protection. And if they don't do that, his life is in danger. He repeatedly makes this point using different forms of words. His life is in danger. He is therefore saying that the royal family are preventing him from being safe. He's saying the royal family are doing their best to ensure that he's in danger. Another way of putting this, somewhat brutally, but clearly it's being intimated in this interview by Harry, is that the royal family are either trying to kill him or they are trying to ensure that he gets killed, basically. And so the key question is, if Harry's theory is that for some strange reason the royal family don't want him to have state protection, why is that? Why would the royal family not want this, given he's saying again and again and again his life is in danger? why would the royal family or the royal household or the state or these institutions in Britain that are involved in making the decision about who gets state protection, why would they want Harry dead? Because he's kind of saying my life's in danger. It's obvious it's in danger. Everyone knows I'm in danger. And yet the royal family and the state and so on are refusing to give me protection. So between the lines, what he's saying is there are people out there who ought to be protecting me, are choosing not to. Given I'm in danger, they are choosing to put my life in danger. In other words, they seem to want me dead. Okay, well, why would that be? Maybe it's true. I don't know. But I mean, it's the elephant in the room, right? And it doesn't. That's a question that doesn't get posed at all during this interview, which is, Harry, why on earth would these people want to put your life in danger? Now, it is possibly true that what Harry is saying is that his life is in some kind of immediate danger, particularly if he's in the UK. But it could well be that one of the reasons why he's not getting the state protection, obviously there are various legal arguments as to whether he's entitled to it or not, now that he's withdrawn from being a member of the royal family. There is an assessment, a question over the risk. He's complaining in the interview that his risk assessment went from very high, and his argument is that at one point the risk assessment was such that he was in the only other person in the royal family in more danger than him was the Queen when she was alive, and now the assessment seems to have gone to zero risk or very low risk, and he's saying somewhat cynically that that's a cynical reappraisal that gets the government and the state and the royal family off the hook of providing protection. So obviously there's controversy about exactly how in danger is this man. He claims, and he hints very heavily, he can't really talk about it, so he's hinting that there's intelligence out there that suggests he's in danger. But we come back to the elephant in the room question. If he is in danger, and it's true, why on earth would the royal family want him dead? Which is kind of what he's saying. And I think it's amazing that people haven't really picked up on that key point. It also leads on to another set of thinking about Harry, which is, has he bought into some conspiracy theories that were certainly around over the tragic loss of his mother, Diana? And has he bought into that? And is he falling victim to conspiracy theories? Obviously, it is the case that it's possible his life really is in some kind of imminent danger, particularly if he's visiting the UK. The argument, it seems to be, then is that you should provide your own security, and you're a wealthy man, and why should you not do that? So when we come to the content psychologically of the interview, there's some very interesting moments psychologically, which is that Harry repeatedly, about 5 or 6 times, so the repetitive nature means although he's articulate, he's not particularly persuasive. He's saying the same point again and again and again, which is that other people who've left public service, just as he has, have still had the protection of the state. So therefore, why should he not have it? In repeating the argument again and again and again, he does appear somewhat psychologically stuck. The reality is that for all of us coping with a difficult world, the world is often not as we would like it to be. To complain again and again that the world is not as we would like it to be and not move forward into trying to cope with the world as we find it, unsatisfactory though that may be, is a key transition into successful coping. There were several statements he made that reveal psychologically that someone in his position appears to be struggling to cope with the reality. The reality is he's been fighting various battles, including legal battles, for quite a few years, maybe five years or so, and he's lost these battles. So the state's just not going to do it. And if the state's not going to do it, what point is there in constantly complaining that it makes logical sense that the state ought to do it? He seems to be not doing task 1 of coping with loss, which is accept the reality of the loss. He has lost, and accept that reality and move on. Find a way of being in the world, dangerous though it may be, provide your own security, move on. And he seems somewhat stuck. And people do get stuck when coping with loss if they don't do task 1, which is accept the reality of the loss. A profoundly important psychological task that people often don't do. Interestingly, they often do task 2, 3, and 4. We'll get to that in a minute. But because they don't do task 1, the effectiveness of doing task 3, 2, 3, and 4 becomes very limited. The brutal power and simplicity of the 4-task model of coping with loss is not only are there 4 tasks you have to do, you've got to do them in the right order. Several things Harry said suggest struggling with this accept the reality of the loss thing. He says things like he was surprised, but then again, not surprised. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't sound entirely rational. He seems to be hinting, because he talks later on in the interview, that again, there's a kind of conspiracy thinking theory here that it's an establishment stitch up. That's a kind of form of words that he used later on. So he's kind of surprised that the judiciary and the legal system should fall into line with the establishment. They're all part of the establishment. That's why I lost. It's not fair. And it's not even legal, possibly. He then goes on to say something like, he now understands that legally there was no way he could ever have won. And then he says, somewhat wryly, he wished someone had told him that. Well, Harry, are you sure your lawyers didn't tell you that actually your chances of winning were slim to non-existent? Are you sure? My experience, and I have spent a lot of time in court as a defense expert witness or a prosecution expert witness from time to time, is that lawyers psychologically are manipulative people, sorry to be blunt about lawyers, and they usually, often in situations like this, are terrifically pessimistic about the chances of winning, even when you've got a good chance of winning. Because what the lawyer's doing there is that when you do win, if the lawyer laid it on thick that you've got no chance, is that you're so grateful you buy them bottles of champagne and stuff, right? So my experience of lawyers is in a situation, if they have kind of bigged up your case so that you think you've got a better chance than you really do, and then you find the crushing blow is the lawyers got it wrong all along, you usually are pretty angry with the lawyers. And I got a slight sense that Harry might be quite angry with his lawyers. But on the other hand, I see a deficiency here, possibly, which I see with a lot of high net worth people that I deal with in my private practice. And it is interesting how disabled, wealthy, famous people who've been mollycoddled throughout their life, become because they just rely too much, because they used to rely on other people to do stuff for them. So they're very easily manipulated and lied to by professionals. They aren't as skeptical as the rest of us are when we have to deal with the tough world. These people get so dependent on servants doing everything for them, and the lawyers become their servant. They're not skeptical enough in terms of handling how you make consultations with professionals and do enough due diligence. So there's a wry statement Harry's kind of saying, I wish someone had told me I had no chance in the first place. Well, are you sure your lawyers didn't tell you your chances were slim to non-existent? In which case, this is the denial factor of not doing task 1 kicking in here. Accept the reality of the loss. Now, he's kind of been fighting this battle again and again and again, losing again and again and again. So really, is it that much of a surprise that you've lost yet again? Really? Did you really get your hopes up that you had a very, very good chance when you keep losing and losing and losing? So there's something about that as well. I mean, to be fair to Harry, he does give this interview very shortly after discovering the shocking news that he's lost, shocking to him at any rate. And he's kind of reeling emotionally from this. You can see this in the interview, and much commentary has been made of this in the press. But what's interesting about that, then, it goes back to my point about denial and not doing task 1 of coping with loss. If you keep losing and then you find this slightly shocking that you've lost yet again, maybe you're in a bit of denial of all the previous losses. But I come back to my point. He goes over and over again what he sees as a self-evident, obvious rightness of his position. It's rational, it's logical as far as he's concerned. And therefore he keeps restating it again and again and again. And we see this often in psychiatry and psychology. People keep restating why they're right and everyone else is wrong. And as a result, they're a bit of a broken record. But the reality is the world has moved on. It has not delivered what you wanted. And I would argue the correct coping response is to stop complaining and instead learn to adjust with the new state of affairs you find yourself in. Interestingly, Harry may be doing task 2, which is vent the emotions. Task 1 is accept reality of the loss. This is successful coping. Task 2 is vent the emotions. He was certainly venting some emotions, but I don't think it was effective venting because he hadn't properly, I suspect, can't say for certain, done task 1. So we see a kind of like restatement again and again, which whenever people are doing that, something's going on psychologically, because it's ineffective. It's ineffective for you, but also it's boring and tedious for other people to hear the same argument again and again and again. So why do that? You're not being effective. So there's that that's going on here. Now, when people are doing this, another way of thinking about what's really going on here is this an attempt, given it looks like he's not able to actually speak directly to his father, the king, to communicate? Is this a communication to the royal family? Is this a way of sending a message? And is the message, I will say damaging things about you until you give me what I want? Is there a kind of blackmail, emotional blackmail thing going on behind this very controversial interview? He talks about, and very movingly, about his father having cancer. He's not sure how long his father's got left, but he does move on rather quickly from that point to go on again and again and again about why it's not fair that he's lost this court case. So again, he's not doing himself a massive number of favors in the way he talks about his father's cancer. He seems a bit more self-preoccupied with his own losses or hurts than concern about his father. And you do get a sense of the fact that if the royal family have really got fed up with him, again, I can't say for certain what's really going on here, of why that might be, because this person does come across as slightly self-centered and wanting to get his way. He seems to skip over the fact he did write a very damaging book, and it might be people got a bit fed up with him for various reasons, and he has great difficulty thinking about what he might have done that might have landed him in a little bit of trouble with the royal family. And that's something we all need to do, is reflect on how it is that we might have brought about, to some extent, our troubles. To what extent do we have personal agency? To what extent do we take personal responsibility for the difficulties that come our way in life? So there is that thing that's going on. Another really interesting thing that might be going on here, given clearly to do the interview would be irritating, to say the least, and the press have made a lot of this, to the royal family. To constantly do things that irritate the people that you want to get on with or want to reconcile with is also kind of strange, but not unknown in psychiatry. And stalkers, the psychology of stalking is quite significant here. Stalkers have been locked out of having a relationship, and particularly with the person they're pursuing, and they get to a stage where just being irritating is a kind of relationship, and that's better than no relationship at all. So stalking doesn't seem to make sense. Pester someone to death to the extent that you do it so much that they begin to hate you, and it's counterproductive. They want to push you away. But at another level, it does make sense. If you have no chance of any kind of relationship, being irritating and annoying and provoking a reaction, even though it's a negative one, is a kind of relationship, not a great one, but it's better than no relationship at all. So sometimes people who are dysfunctional are irritating because it provokes a reaction and is some kind of relationship. So there is the possibility of something like that maybe going on here, and maybe what we can read between the lines in this interview. Now, he talks a little bit about reconciliation and not wanting to constantly be in conflict. But again, there's a weird juxtaposition of ideas here. You've just said you think these people that you now say you want to reconcile with seem to want you dead. They don't want to protect you and you're in danger. So why would you want to have a relationship with people who want you dead? There's, again, something paradoxical. We see a lot of this in psychiatry and psychology. People complaining about other people. If only these other people would behave themselves, then everything would be fine. And I do want to have a relationship with them. And that kind of complaining, some people might even go as far as saying whining and whinging about someone, yet wanting a relationship, is counterproductive and destructive. So the 4 tasks of coping with loss. Task 1, accept the reality of the loss. Harry is reeling, shocked at this verdict, and he gives this interview very shortly afterwards. He doesn't appear to have done task 1. He doesn't seem to accept many of the losses that have come his way as a result of some of the decisions, some people would say, that he has made in terms of his relationship with the royal family. And so task 1, accept the reality of the loss. Task 2, in coping successfully with any loss or all losses, is vent the emotions. You can only do that effectively if you've done task 1. Task 3, which must be done after task 1 and 2, is learn new skills. any loss that we have. It's a person that was your boyfriend or girlfriend, did all the cooking and the tax return, and they're gone now. You're going to have to learn to do the cooking and the tax return. All losses involve learning new skills. The stress and strain and the hassle of learning these new skills is partly what causes difficulty in coping with loss. Harry needs to learn some new skills, like, for example, how to figure out his own way to protect himself, given the state has said no, and he's refusing to accept the no. In refusing to accept the no, he's not moving on and figuring out how to be in the world and do so safely by providing his own protection. He is, after all, a fairly wealthy man. So again, notice something. There's a self-destructive thing going on here, which we see often with people struggling to cope with loss, which is in going on and on and on about how it's not safe for you, you fail to move on, you fail to provide your own protection, because should you provide your own protection, you wouldn't have the argument that, you need state protection. Okay, so there's a thing going on here, which is, my life's in danger, the state needs to protect me. I could throw a lot of resources at providing my own protection. Harry's argument is, if he did that, he would still be in more danger than if he had state protection. He's not getting state protection. Hello, wake up, smell the coffee, it's not happening, move on, figure out a way to be safe in the world, as many other people have to, with much less resources than you have. The other thing that he did, which I think, so that's part of task 3, learn new skills. He's not learning new skills. There are many new skills he probably has to learn. We all have to learn new skills when it comes to coping with loss. The other thing that I think he did that was psychologically counterproductive in terms of public relations and impression management was to keep going on about public service. He mentioned public service in relationship to himself many, many times. He talked about serving in Afghanistan. Well, again, I'm not so sure tactically how wise that was. Many brave soldiers have served in Afghanistan and not had the kind of privileged protection and position that Harry's had. So, they're not going around whining or whinging that they don't have state protection, and many of them are still in danger as a result of serving in Afghanistan. So, to keep referring to himself as a public servant and providing a lot of public service, I'm not so sure was that helpful for him. I just want to make a side point here. We often have a problem in job interviews where we're trying to big ourselves up. And we could say something like Harry's trying to say in this interview, which is, I did a lot of public service. It's very unwise to own a statement like that in quite that way, because it seems very, very self-serving and people are going to view it very skeptically. It's much better to refer to comments other people have made that you've done a lot of public service. He could have said something like, well, the Archbishop of Canterbury commented on the fact that I do a lot of public service compared to some other members of the royal family. If you use an authority external to yourself to make the point you're trying to make, it comes over as way more credible than you claiming some compliment for yourself. So I thought that was a bit clumsy. And given this is a privileged man, high status, would have a lot of public relations resources available to him, I'm concerned about the poor quality of advice it would appear he is receiving from what we can tell from this interview. The final task is reinvest the emotions. Task 4, the final task, reinvest emotions. Task 1, accept reality of the loss. Task 2, vent the emotions. Task 3, learn new skills. Task 4, reinvest the emotions. What does that mean? Let's take a tragic example. Parents lose a child in a car crash. Reinvest the emotions. They are bereft. In a period of time, they may start a charity to help children who learn better how to cross the road if their child died in a car crash of some kind. So reinvest the emotions is the emotions that were invested in the child that are now have to have somewhere to go, get reinvested in a new project. It's not a child, but it's a project which could take up the emotional energy that was invested in the child. So reinvest the emotions, very powerful, very important task 4. And there's a strong sense of what is Harry up to since he left the royal family? Is it possible, because he hasn't reinvested emotions, carved out a proper role for himself, he keeps harking back to the only role he can seem to find, which is to complain and to whine and get involved in legal cases in relationship to these people that he's left. So that's one of the problems, another example of where he may not have done task 4. So I hope that has been helpful. I use the interview as a vehicle to talk about the 4 tasks coping with loss, which I think is very, very important. And I believe that the interview is quite significant in terms of some of the things it tells us about Harry, but you've got to read between the lines. And I think psychology and psychiatry offer an opportunity to read between the lines and see signals that other people aren't seeing. And I thought the quality, I'm afraid, of the interview was poor because the journalist conducting the interview just asked some very basic questions and didn't go deeper. But again, one of the suspicions we have of legacy media is, are they all in it together? Are they all part of the same establishment? And therefore they don't put each other to the sword and ask the tough questions that need to be asked. I hope you found that helpful and interesting. I want to emphasize again that I'm not so much interested in psychoanalyzing Harry. What I'm much more interested in using the interview is as a vehicle to communicate some fundamentally important points about coping with loss.